It was supposed to be a routine patrol. It turned into a bloodbath. On July 2nd, 1967, U.S. Marines from the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, a unit known as the Walking Dead, marched into the tall grass near Con Thien, a remote outpost in Vietnam. They had no idea they were walking straight into a carefully planned North Vietnamese Army NVA ambush. Within minutes, gunfire and explosions ripped through their ranks. The enemy was everywhere, hidden in bunkers, dug in trenches and thick vegetation. The battle that followed became one of the deadliest engagements of the Vietnam War. Outnumbered and surrounded, the Marines fought desperately to survive. Some held their ground as their ammunition ran out. Others played dead to avoid execution. Reinforcements rushed in, but they too were slaughtered in a second ambush. By the time the battle ended, nearly an entire Marine company had been wiped out. Operation Buffalo became a symbol of both American courage and the brutal reality of war. What really happened that day? Why did so many Marines die? And how did the survivors make it out alive? This is the untold story of Operation Buffalo, where heroes were made, lives were lost, and the cost of war was paid in blood. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe now. This is history you won't forget. 2. The strategic importance of Con Thien. In 1967, the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ in Vietnam, was anything but peaceful. The area separating North and South Vietnam was supposed to be a buffer zone, but instead it became one of the most dangerous battlefields of the war. Con Thien, a small U.S. Marine Corps outpost near the DMZ, sat right in the middle of this chaos. The U.S. military needed Con Thien to block North Vietnamese Army, NVA troops, from flooding into South Vietnam. From this base, American forces could launch attacks, spot enemy movements, and protect key supply routes. But the NVA saw Con Thien as a threat to their plans. They wanted it wiped off the map. For months before Operation Buffalo, NVA artillery pounded Con Thien. Enemy mortars and rockets rained down daily, turning the outpost into a living nightmare. The Marines there faced constant attacks, sniper fire, and brutal trench warfare. By mid-1967, U.S. commanders knew the enemy was preparing something big. Intelligence reports showed thousands of NVA troops gathering near the DMZ, but instead of waiting to be attacked, the U.S. launched Operation Buffalo, a mission to take control of the area and crush enemy forces before they could strike. What the Marines didn't know was that the NVA was already waiting for them, hidden and ready to kill. The stage was set. The battle was about to begin. When Operation Buffalo began, both sides were prepared for a fight, but only one side knew it was coming. The United States Marine Corps believed they were launching an offensive to clear out enemy forces near Con Thien, but the North Vietnamese Army, NVM, had already set a deadly trap. United States forces, the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, 1/9, led the operation. This unit had already earned a reputation for toughness, but they would soon suffer so many casualties that they became known as the Walking Dead. Reinforcements came from the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, along with support from artillery, airstrikes, and naval gunfire. The U.S. also deployed F-4 Phantom jets, A-4 Skyhawks, and B-52 bombers to hammer enemy positions. North Vietnamese Army, the 324B Division, 90th Regiment of the NVA was no ordinary force. These battle-hardened troops were skilled in ambush tactics, bunker warfare, and close-quarters combat. They were supported by hidden artillery positions across the DMZ, allowing them to strike American forces while remaining safe in North Vietnam. Unlike the U.S. Marines, the NVA had been preparing for this battle for weeks. They had dug bunkers, hidden machine gun nests, and set up deadly kill zones. They wanted the Marines to come. They wanted them to walk straight into their trap. On July 2nd, 1967, that trap was sprung. The bloodbath began. The battle begins. Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines set out from Con Thien. Their mission was simple: patrol Highway 561, a key dirt road running through the war-torn landscape near the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ. The goal was to clear enemy forces and secure the area for future operations. The Marines moved cautiously, but everything seemed quiet. Too quiet. Thick elephant grass and scattered tree lines made it hard to see ahead. The morning air was heavy with humidity, and the Marines wiped sweat from their faces as they pushed forward. Some felt uneasy. They had been in Vietnam long enough to know that when the enemy was silent, something was wrong. Then at 9:15 a.m., the silence shattered. Without warning, heavy machine gun fire and mortar rounds exploded all around them. Marines were cut down instantly as bullets tore through their ranks. Screams of wounded men filled the air. The North Vietnamese had been waiting, hidden in deep trenches and reinforced bunkers. Captain Sterling Coates, the commanding officer of Alpha Company, was killed almost immediately. With their leader down and radio signals jammed, the Marines were in chaos. They had walked straight into a kill zone, and the enemy was closing in. Some tried to return fire, but they were pinned down. Others attempted to retreat, only to find enemy forces behind them as well. They were surrounded. The trap had been set, and it had worked perfectly. For Alpha Company, the fight for survival had just begun. The NVA ambush. The Marines of Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines were trapped. Machine guns, mortars, and RPGs rained down on them from all directions. Within minutes, dozens of Marines lay dead or wounded. Those who could still fight scrambled for cover, but there was nowhere to hide. The enemy had the advantage. They had planned this ambush for weeks. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA 90th Regiment, had set up a near-perfect kill zone. Bunkers and trenches were hidden under thick grass, giving the enemy complete cover. Machine guns and snipers were positioned at strategic points, cutting off any escape. The Marines were being ripped apart before they even had a chance to react. The chaos of battle, with Captain Sterling Coates dead, command fell into disarray. Communications were jammed by the enemy, leaving the Marines unable to call for help. Some squads tried to advance, but they were cut down almost immediately. Others tried to retreat, only to run straight into more hidden enemy forces. Marines fought back as best they could, returning fire in short bursts, crawling through blood-soaked grass, and using the bodies of fallen comrades for cover. Some fought hand-to-hand as NVA soldiers emerged from their trenches, stabbing and shooting at point-blank range. Navy corpsmen, the battlefield medics, worked desperately to treat the wounded, often shielding dying Marines with their own bodies. Many were killed as they tried to save their brothers. Surrounded with no escape by midday, Alpha Company was nearly wiped out. Out of 140 Marines, only a handful were still able to fight. The rest were either dead, wounded, or missing. Some survivors played dead, hoping the enemy wouldn't execute them. Others made last stands, firing their last bullets before being overrun. But the battle wasn't over. Reinforcements were coming, and the NVA was ready for them too. Operation Buffalo was quickly turning into a nightmare. 6. A desperate fight for survival. The battlefield was a nightmare. Smoke and dust filled the air, mixing with the screams of the wounded and the deafening sound of gunfire. Alpha Company was almost gone. The Marines who could still fight were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely surrounded. The North Vietnamese were not just attacking from a distance, they were moving in to finish the job. Fighting to the last bullet. Some Marines refused to give up. With no clear orders and no way to communicate, small groups of men fought on their own, holding their positions until the very end. They fired from bomb craters, behind the bodies of fallen comrades, and from whatever cover they could find. Many fought until their rifles were empty, then switched to grenades, knives, and even their bare hands. Lance Corporal Billy Singleton, already wounded, saw an NVA soldier advancing on him. Out of ammo, he grabbed his entrenching tool, a small shovel, and smashed the enemy soldier's skull before crawling to cover. He was one of the few to make it out alive. The heroic efforts of Navy corpsmen. The battlefield medics, known as Navy corpsmen, performed acts of pure bravery. Under heavy fire, they dragged wounded Marines to safety, used their own bodies as shields, and tried to keep their brothers alive. One corpsman, Donald McLaren, ran through enemy fire to save a wounded Marine. Just as he reached him, a bullet tore through his own body, but he refused to stop. He patched up the Marine and dragged him back to cover before collapsing from blood loss. Some played dead to survive. For many Marines, fighting wasn't an option. The NVA was executing the wounded, finishing off any Marine still moving. Some Marines, covered in the blood of their dead friends, pretended to be dead. lying motionless as enemy soldiers walked past them. One survivor later recalled watching an NBA soldier bayonet his fallen friends one by one, making sure no one was alive. He held his breath and prayed they would pass him by. By the time reinforcements were on their way, it was too late for most of Alpha Company, but the bloodshed was far from over. News of Alpha Company's destruction spread quickly. By mid-afternoon on July 2, 1967, U.S. commanders realized they had just lost an entire Marine company. They immediately ordered Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines to move in and rescue any survivors. But the NVA had planned for this too. Bravo Company moved cautiously, advancing toward the last known position of Alpha Company. They didn't know they were walking into a second ambush. The second trap. As Bravo Company approached the battlefield, NVA machine guns opened fire from hidden bunkers. Mortar shells exploded around them, sending Marines flying. Within minutes, the rescue mission turned into another slaughter. The NVA had dug deep, reinforced trenches, allowing them to fire, disappear, and move unseen. U.S. Marines tried to push forward, but every step was met with deadly resistance. One Marine, Lance Corporal James O'Connor, recalled crawling through the grass, watching his fellow Marines drop one by one. "Everywhere I looked, there were bodies," he later said. "We never saw them coming." Reinforcements keep coming. As the sun began to set, more Marine units from the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines were sent in. The NVA continued to fight fiercely, refusing to retreat. By the end of the day, over 80 more Marines were dead. The battle was spiraling out of control. The U.S. needed a new plan, one that didn't involve sending more men into the enemy's kill zones. The next move would be massive. By July 3, 1967, it was clear that sending more Marines into the enemy's kill zones was suicide. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, was too well dug in, their ambushes too deadly. U.S. commanders needed to change tactics. Instead of marching more men into the trap, they decided to bring the full power of American firepower down on the enemy. Carpet bombing and artillery barrages. At dawn, the U.S. launched one of the most intense bombardments of the war. B-52 bombers carpet-bombed the battlefield, dropping thousands of pounds of explosives. F-4 Phantom jets and A-4 Skyhawks unleashed napalm and cluster bombs, setting entire sections of the jungle on fire. Naval gunfire from offshore warships pounded NVA positions with heavy artillery. The ground shook as fire and explosions consumed the enemy bunkers. The NVA had dug deep, but no trench was safe from the relentless bombing. Marines launch a brutal counterattack. After hours of bombardment, 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, 3/9, launched a full assault. Moving in with tanks and armored vehicles, the Marines fought trench to trench, clearing out NVA positions one by one. Many NVA soldiers, realizing they were losing, fought to the death. Others tried to retreat but were cut down by U.S. airstrikes and artillery. The battle turned into close-quarters combat, with Marines using flamethrowers, grenades, and bayonets to clear bunkers. The NVA finally withdraws. After 2 days of relentless fighting, the NVA finally abandoned the battlefield, leaving behind hundreds of dead soldiers and destroyed weapons. The Marines had won the fight, but at a terrible cost. Operation Buffalo had crippled the NVA's ability to operate in the area, but the U.S. paid for it in blood. The battle was over, but the suffering had just begun. The battle was over, but the damage was done. Operation Buffalo had turned into one of the deadliest battles of the Vietnam War for U.S. Marines. The human cost. The final toll was staggering: 159 Marines killed, 345 Marines wounded, over 1,290 North Vietnamese soldiers dead. The Marines of 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, 1/9. The Walking Dead had been nearly wiped out. Some survivors were rescued days later, found hiding among the bodies of their fallen brothers. Others were missing, some captured, some never found. Many of the Marines who made it out alive were physically and mentally scarred forever. The horrors of the battle, the sight of friends being gunned down or executed, haunted them for the rest of their lives. What went wrong? Operation Buffalo exposed major failures in U.S. intelligence and strategy. The NVA was far more prepared than expected. Marine patrols were sent in without enough support. The enemy used superior ambush tactics, forcing Marines into deadly kill zones. Some officers later admitted that the operation should have never been carried out as planned. The Marines had been sent into a trap, and they paid the price. A costly victory. In the end, the U.S. declared Operation Buffalo a success because they had inflicted heavy losses on the enemy. But for the Marines who fought there, it felt like anything but a victory. The battle proved one thing. The NVA was not afraid of fighting U.S. forces head-on, and they were willing to pay the price in blood. The war was far from over. The 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, 1/9, had always been a tough unit, but after Operation Buffalo, they earned a new name, the Walking Dead. The nickname came from their incredibly high casualty rate throughout the Vietnam War. No other Marine unit suffered as many losses. By the end of Operation Buffalo, nearly an entire company had been wiped out. The survivors were physically and emotionally shattered. Many had watched their closest friends die in front of them. Some had barely escaped, playing dead among fallen Marines to avoid execution. The battle left deep scars on those who lived through it. Many struggled with survivors' guilt, nightmares, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, for the rest of their lives. The brutality of the ambush, the sight of Marines being cut down in seconds, never left them. Despite the horrors they faced, the Marines of 19 never backed down. They continued to fight in some of the toughest battles of the war, always standing their ground no matter the odds. Their courage became legendary. Years later, veterans of the battalion gathered to honor their fallen brothers, ensuring that the sacrifices made during Operation Buffalo would never be forgotten. The Walking Dead had earned their name, but they were never truly defeated. 11th. Operation Buffalo became one of the most studied battles of the Vietnam War. It showed the bravery of U.S. Marines, but also exposed the deadly effectiveness of North Vietnamese ambush tactics. Military leaders later used it as a lesson in combat strategy, reconnaissance failures, and the cost of underestimating the enemy. For the Marines who fought there, however, it was more than just history. It was a memory that never faded. Many who survived carried the weight of what happened for the rest of their lives. The sights, sounds, and smells of the battlefield stayed with them, haunting their dreams. Some never spoke about it. Others spent years trying to make sense of what they had lived through. Today, the men of the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, the Walking Dead, are honored for their sacrifice. Veterans' reunions, memorials, and books ensure that the names of the fallen are never forgotten. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C., bears the names of many Marines who lost their lives in Operation Buffalo. Both American and Vietnamese veterans who fought in this battle later reflected on the cost of war. Some met decades later, not as enemies, but as soldiers who had survived the same nightmare. Operation Buffalo was a tragedy, but it also became a symbol of the courage, resilience, and sacrifice of those who fought in Vietnam. Operation Buffalo was more than just another battle in the Vietnam War. It was a test of courage, survival, and sacrifice. The Marines of 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, the Walking Dead, walked into a nightmare, fought with everything they had, and suffered horrific losses. Despite the ambush, despite being outnumbered and surrounded, they refused to give up. This battle exposed the brutality of the Vietnam War. It showed how deadly the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, could be and how dangerous it was to underestimate them. It also proved the unbreakable spirit of the U.S. Marines, who fought against impossible odds and never backed down. For those who survived, the memories of July 2nd to 3rd, 1967 never faded. They carried the weight of that battle for the rest of their lives. Many of them returned home to a country that didn't fully understand what they had been through. But their story matters. Their sacrifices matter. History remembers battles, but it's the people who fought them that truly define them. The men of Operation Buffalo paid a terrible price, and it's our duty to remember what they went through. Thank you for watching and for taking the time to learn about this incredible story of bravery and sacrifice. If you want to hear more untold stories of history, make sure to subscribe. These stories deserve to be remembered.